So you've already mentioned this a little bit, Lisa, but let's talk a little bit in your work as a researcher there. What are some of the psychological, relational, and societal effects that you all are seeing of widespread pornography use? You talked about more are consuming than ever before, and we know that's true. What effect is that having on us as a people?
Right. Well, there's really mountains of research now about the harms of pornography out there, and we have spent recently. We just spent a significant amount of time reviewing some of that research in relation to a brief that we helped submit that our law center submitted to in a Supreme Court case dealing with the age verification laws that Texas has put forward, and there's been litigation brought against it by the Free Speech Coalition, and so a bunch of groups are responding to that. So I've definitely had the opportunity lately to spend some time in this space, but the harm, it's so upsetting. There's so many harms and things that that are behavioral or attitudinal. So things like permissive sexual attitudes that you're going to have less barriers, less natural inhibitions towards engaging with sex. You're going to have there's earlier sexual debut, so a younger age. And now that's important because the younger you engage in sexual activity, the more likely you are to have some adverse outcomes, like unintended pregnancies. And if you have an unattended pregnancy, then that can really impact your career trajectories and your ability to earn livelihood and so forth. So there's definite repercussions from these things. There's also, well, casual and impersonal sex. Your acceptance of that increases. Condomless sex is associated with pornography use. Greater lifetime number of sex partners. That's really dangerous, as I think we could all just immediately intuit the danger of having lots of sex partners. Greater likelihood of engaging in group sex. And a really big one that we've spent a lot of time talking about at Nicosi is child-on-child harmful sexual behavior. So the problem that we're seeing is you have children exposed to pornography, and of course, children they learn by seeing and emulating, copying behaviors that they see, right? A lot of us remember growing up and playing doctor, right? Or playing school, right? Where we're emulating what we saw the classroom. Somebody's the teacher, somebody's sitting, and okay. So children learn by emulating. So they see pornography. And what are they going to do? They're going to try to emulate that with the children around them. And there's so many cases. I really think that this is a hidden epidemic across the country. There's signs of it within schools. Like, for instance, there was a major series of articles, investigative stories that the Associated Press did. It's been a few years. I can't remember precisely if it was 2020 or somewhere around in there, but a series of articles that they did looking at sexual violence in schools, and the majority of it was perpetrated by children, not by adults. So the mindset that we have as adults is that, it's the coach, it's the teacher, where we got to make sure that they're not harming the children. It's the other children who are perpetrating the vast majority of the abuse against children in schools. So child-on-child harmful sexual behavior is a huge one. And I know people that in their families that has happened. It's just heartbreaking because, the children are really, they're innocent. It's not, I should say the small children, right? They're not doing it with an intent to harm, but this can, the older that it occurs, let's say it's a teen child, and that teenager starts manipulating a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old, right? So then you start getting these power imbalances that can happen between children, and it becomes exploitive, and it can turn abuse, like really intentionally attempting to hurt the other child. So there's again a spectrum here within the world of child-on-child harmful sexual behavior. Some of it is truly innocent. And I wouldn't want to say that every child behavior is wrong. Sexual behavior is wrong. Some of it's just a part of development, right? Learning about their bodies, and maybe touching something, but it's not. That can all. There's an appropriate spectrum of sexual learning that happens as you grow. But when it starts developing into actual sex acts between small children, that is way off the age appropriate scale. And that's because they've seen pornography and they start emulating it on others. So that's a big one. And there's some others, like things maybe people hadn't thought of, like reduced academic performance. There's not a huge amount of research in that area yet, and there's been some mixed studies, but there are some that indicate that learning performance is impacted, and that doesn't surprise me in the slightest. Sexist attitudes, and then um, as adults, we're definitely seeing there's a lot of studies that indicate depression among the adult users of pornography. And I think that's such a huge concern considering just the mental health of our society writ large. Like, why would we want to be participating in something that's going to worsen your mental health?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you heard, Lisa, we did some research with the Barna group last year, and that was some of the questions we asked, was asking about people's mental health, both positive aspects of, I feel fulfillment, I feel connected, I feel joy in life, and then also asked about the negative aspects of things like depression, anxiety, even thoughts of harm towards self. And there is just, if you look at the research, there is a direct line of correlation between the more pornography someone watches or reported watching, the more unhealthy they report their mental health being. And it
Mhm.
just is so clear when you look at it. It's like, wow, it's stark to see. The more porn someone views, the higher they rank things like anxiety, fear, and thoughts of depression and self-harm. And so, yeah, I think you're underscoring in so many ways the massive, massive impact this has on our society.
Hmm. Yeah, and I know it feels to some of us, and I'm curious of your take because this is again your world, but for us moms, I have some adult sons and some teenage kids, and it just, like you said, it's so different than how I experienced exposure to pornography when I was a kid. So now, what legal gaps exist in regulating the pornography industry, and what do you think is needed as far as policy changes in order to address exploitation?
Right. Well, I thought I think I'll start with just explaining a little bit about the legal landscape on pornography because there's a huge blind spot most people have. The fact is that the United States at the federal level has laws that prohibit distribution of what's called obscenity. So obscenity, it's pornography, but it's basically adjudicated. It's something that a jury has to look at the material, or at least some of the material, and say, you know what, this defies our community standards. And the United States has this long legal history of saying that obscenity is not protected speech. And I think most of us, I know I grew up pretty clueless about that because you wouldn't know that from what you see around us, right?
Mhm.
And that's because there's not been meaningful enforcement of our obscenity laws for over a decade. It's getting close to two. It's been a long time since there's been meaningful enforcement of our obscenity laws. It's complicated. It's not easy work, but it can be done. In fact, the man who formerly was the president of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, Patrick Truman, he headed the Department of Justice's office on what I'm trying to remember. It was the child exploitation and obscenity section at the Department of Justice. And this was back in the 80s under President Reagan. And there was this really concerted effort that they were going to go after the distributors of hardcore pornography, not just child material, not just child sexual abuse material, but even material that featured people who were adults, and they were going to prosecute the distributors of obscenity. It was massively successful, incredibly successful. So many pornographers went to jail. And I wish I knew the exact number of how many, but dozens and dozens of cases that they were successful in prosecuting distributors of pornography. So there is not a right to distribute pornography in the United States, not through the mail, not through cable television, and not through the internet. And I should say, I mean, I think just then I said pornography, but I should say there's not a right to distribute obscenity.
Right.
And the problem is that we can't just declare that all the pornography out there is obscene. It has to be a prosecutor, a U.S. prosecutor, or even at a state that has obscenity laws, a state prosecutor could do this as well. They have to do an investigation, confiscate material, call a jury, look at the material, and make a case, present a case, and then they decide: does this material, is it obscene? And so then the individual who's distributing that material could be prosecuted. So my point in telling you all this is that one of the biggest problems that we've had is the epic failure, the willful failure to prosecute obscenity in the United States. And that is, I would say, more than anything, why we're sitting here having this conversation. Because if those people who were distributing this material, this obscenity, were prosecuted, we wouldn't have the oceans, literally oceans of pornography that exist on the internet. Mm-hmm. If the distributors were being meaningfully prosecuted for distribution of obscenity. So that is the number one factor. So that doesn't require a legal fix. The law is there. It just requires the will of the people to insist that law enforcement entities, prosecutors, both at the federal and the state level, for the states that have obscenity laws, bring obscenity cases.
Wow.
I mean, it'd be practically like falling off a log. There's so much obscenity out there. Like, I don't think there's any shortage of effort to find it, right? Right. Now, the hard part might be figuring out because the people who distribute it now, there's a lot of that's a little bit more complicated. But in terms of finding the obscene material, it's there in plain sight. So anyway, that's one issue I would raise. And then the other is what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I think more than any particular piece of legislation or law that's out there, this has been an impediment to preventing sexual exploitation in many fronts, both sex trafficking online, but also any kind of going after distributors of this material online. This is why, like, for instance, websites, social media sites are now able to hide behind Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and use it basically as a shield to say that they are never culpable for anything that third parties post on their site, no matter what it is and whether or not they knew about it or not, or how long they knew about it. It's never their fault. They're never responsible. And this has been a massive problem, because that's what fueled the whole phenomenon of like Backpage, which was basically a prostitution advertising website that metastasized and became gigantic, and that was fueling sex trafficking all over the country. But now, because of CDA 230, we've seen this massive migration of pornography, even child sexual abuse material, onto platforms like Reddit. And the courts are saying that's fine, that they can host that material, because they claim that the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act shields the companies from any kind of liability or culpability from hosting the material.